Since 1968, America has observed National Hispanic Heritage Month, otherwise known as Latino Heritage Month, from September 15th to October 15th. Now, despite signs of progress with America's marginalized groups, there is still a lot of work to be done, especially when it comes to things like immigration, human rights, and workplace discrimination. The Pew Research Center found that the U.S. Hispanic population in 2020 accounted for 51% of the entire U.S. population growth in that same year. Despite the stats, Black and Hispanic workers are the most underrepresented in the highest paying and most influential positions and overrepresented in roles such as assistants and laborers. So what do? Some are taking matters into their own hands. A record number of Latino entrepreneurs are starting businesses at a rate higher than the national average. According to the 2020 State of Latino Entrepreneurship Report, the number of Latino-owned businesses has grown 34% over the past 10 years compared to just 1% of all other small business categories. Creating real systemic change is a continuous journey that requires us to always keep taking steps forward, no matter how big or how small. This is the work in progress. I caught up with Christine De La Rosa, CEO and co-founder of the People's Ecosystem and CBX Shield, to talk about her entrepreneurial journey. Your entrepreneurial journey started about 5 or 6 years ago. Tell me about what led you on that path of entrepreneurship in this space.
I've had 2 restaurants while I was working a full-time job. I had a gallery. I had a retail shop while I was doing a full-time job, which all came to a smashing halt in 2010 when I had a pulmonary embolism after being sick for 3 years and nobody knew what my mystery illness was. But I did have a pulmonary embolism in 2010 from undiagnosed lupus, and then spent the next 5 years really unable to work and unable to move and pretty much homebound because I was on 11 medications a day. 5 of those were opioids, and I was on a monthly infusion. And that's actually what led me to cannabis. Now, I could have tried cannabis 5 years before when I first got sick because I was living in California where it was legal, except I'm Mexican. And all of the propaganda around cannabis has really been to tell people that it's bad, that it's scary, that it's this is your brain on drugs. But if you were Mexican, which is really a lot of stigma around it, you don't even think about cannabis as something that you would do, because my mother told me, don't ever do cannabis. She never told me not to drink alcohol, but she said, don't ever do cannabis because they're going to think you're a lazy Mexican. And it took me about 9 months, but in the 9 months that I was testing on myself, I found a cannabis regimen that I use until this day. And after 9 months, I was able to get off all 11 medications plus the monthly infusion. So I've been in remission since 2015. So now almost 6 years. September is my born date, is what I say for cannabis use. And I walk fine. I'm not homebound. I'm able to travel. I'm able to work, which I wasn't able to do those 5 years that I was really sick. And that was how I got to my cannabis entrepreneurial journey.
Thinking about your first entrepreneurial steps, sure, there was some magic, in the medicine and how your life changed, but also from a business standpoint, I'm sure at that point in time, there weren't a lot of other minorities, especially Latinas, in the cannabis industry. What was that early experience like in terms of, hey, I'm starting a business and now I'm off to a journey? What were some of the hurdles and maybe some opportunities you saw along the way?
I think that one of the biggest things that I saw when I first entered into the space was I was going to these large conferences. Many times I'd be the only woman. Many times I'd be the only person of color in the room. And so that was a huge hurdle because most of the people that were investing in cannabis at the time are used to investing in people that look like them, and I didn't look like them. So that was a really big hurdle for me to get over.
What have been some resources you found for Hispanic entrepreneurs, and what did you wish existed, and what are you seeing coming to fruition now that you've been in the game for a little while?
So I'm going to tell you truthfully, there's not a lot of resources for Hispanic, Latino cannabis companies because of the huge stigma that we have been enduring for the last 80 years. I think that that's changing. It's been changing quite rapidly, I would say, in the last 12 months, especially when Mexico legalized cannabis for their whole country. Now we're starting to see more Latin investors, more Latin groups come together. But prior to that, there was almost nothing because that was a bad thing. I mean, the very first time I told my parents, I flew to Texas to tell my parents I was going to be opening up a cannabis company. My mother literally immediately said to me, "Why are you always shaming the family?" Because that was what they do. Now they help me with my CBD business, with the citrus CBD, because they've come along and I've taught them.
As an entrepreneur, right, there are some blatant incidences of racism and exclusion, and then there are some more hidden, examples of that. Can you maybe give us an example of one or the other?
Sure. I was in New York and I was meeting with an investor at one of those fancy private clubs that I had never been into. So I was like, wow, this is really fancy. And we were sitting down and I was explaining our business model, because part of our business model is we have built an entire company with the idea of social equity and social justice as our framework. And the thing he said came out of his mouth. He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know that. I don't invest in social welfare." And that was such a shocking thing for me to hear from somebody, that the idea of making sure that you're good, I'm good, they're good was considered social welfare. And I remember getting up from that table and just saying thank you for his time and leaving. And then about a year later, when they started to realize that in cannabis, social equity, social justice was going to be a very big thing, he wrote me and he's like, "I understand what you were talking about. I'd love to invest in you." And I said, "Thank you so much, but I'm not going to take investment from you because you don't have a belief system in what I'm trying to do."
And speaking of the people that you work with, right, your team is very diverse. Tell me a little bit about that. And was that by design, or was it happenstance, and was it easy? Like, give me the ins and outs of forming that team.
It was absolutely by design. I mean, when we started out, when it was just a few of us, the founders, we always said we wanted to have a very diverse team and we wanted to center women of color, because a lot of times in the C-suites, you see the women of color as like the director of HR or the director of marketing. You very rarely see women of color, or men of color, to be honest, that have actual oversight of the profit and losses, right, of a company. They're always designated to non-monetary, like, "See, we have diversity," but it's in the HR department where they make no decisions about the company.
You obviously know your stuff. You know your way around the business. You know your way around the science. With it being Hispanic Heritage Month, right? What advice do you give for upcoming entrepreneurs, especially BIPOC entrepreneurs, with their journeys and what they're facing and will be heading into in the near future?
I think it's very exciting for BIPOC entrepreneurs. I think we're seeing that in small businesses, even outside of the cannabis industry. But here's the one thing I'll tell you that I think is so true. You must be involved in your legislative system, whether that's city, state, municipality, federal. It's sometimes, laws are always being written and they're always being passed. And sometimes we become very complacent and we're like, "Oh, well, I'm just going to do what they tell me. Once they decide what they're going to do, I'll just follow the rules." And sometimes what is happening is that they're actually regulating you out of the market and you don't realize it until it's too late.
Diversity, inclusion, and representation are paramount in today's media industry. I spoke with Emmy award-winning journalist and president at the Futuro Media Group, Maria Hinojosa, to discuss her experiences as a Latino business leader in America. Another word that's X'd out of your vocabulary is Hispanic. Tell me about that.
Hispanic only refers to people who speak Spanish or who have roots in Spain. And the whole thing about being Mexican or being mestiza, which means mixed, is that I do have clearly Spanish blood. I know that. But also I have indigenous blood. So to only call me Hispanic means that the whole side of me that is indigenous is cast away. And so, and now Latino is a conversation. Is it Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine? And I welcome all the conversation. What matters to me is that people in general understand that it's not about Latinos and Latinas and celebrating us for a month. Like, we are here. We are not going anywhere, and our presence is only growing. So how do you feel about that? Because I'm cool.
So when we read your bio, it says first Latina everywhere. What is the pressure of being the first, and what is the opportunity of being the first?
I at first I was just like, oh my God, I have a job, right? I did the thing. I was able to show to my parents, I got the college degree and I got the job. You don't have to worry. Once I got inside, I was like, whoa, okay. To be honest, they did not realize there was no conversation around white privilege at all, or white privilege in understanding the media or their presentation as such. So, because I was a young journalist and actually had been doing journalism, I was hyper aware of that. And I just was like, okay, well, I have to realize my own privilege. I'm privileged to be here at NPR, at CNN, at PBS as the first. I have privilege, and so now I have responsibility to respond to my audience. When I am proposing a story that then my editor said what he said to me, which is like, oh God, Maria, we all know about your Latino agenda. And I was like, what are you talking about, my Latino agenda? Like, I'm just being the best journalist that I know to be. And so if I'm telling stories about this community, it's because they matter and you should want to know. It's not about a Latino agenda. And my colleagues actually said these things to me. Or one time, a very famous NPR personality said, weren't you terrified to be in the South Bronx? And I was like, no, I know those communities. I'm not afraid to walk those streets. But I was terrified when I stepped foot into NPR for the very first time. But you can't understand that fear.
It is most unfair, though, to legal immigrants to allow illegals to hop in front of them and cheat the system.
What you cannot do is to label a person illegal. And the reason why I say this is not because I learned it from some radical Latino or Latina studies professor when I was a college student. I learned it from Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust, who said, you know what? The first thing they did was that they declared the Jews to be an illegal people. And that's what we're talking about at this point.
So fast forward, you've started your own imprint, your own outlet, and the team is diverse. Is that by design? Did you set out to make that a goal? And how did that play out in the design of the organization?
150%. I set out to create a newsroom like the one I wanted to see, when people say in large corporate media, they're just like, wow, we don't have a pipeline. We can't find journalists of color. Where are the Black editors? Where are the Latino producers or the Asian writers? And it's just like, actually, they're there. And so it was very intentional to create a newsroom that was highly diverse and representative, which means it includes everybody, including straight white men of privilege. Of course.
And with that, what does the future look like, if through your lens specifically, when it comes to people of color in the media and entrepreneurial industries?
So I feel like we as journalists have to be kind of multi-pronged. I encourage, I'm also, look, I'm Mexican, so I have 16 jobs. One of them is that I'm also a professor at Barnard College, my alma mater here at part of Columbia University. And so I encourage my students, if they want to be journalists, I'm like, look, if you feel like you can, sure, you should go into the corporate media, have that experience, be highly aware. Golden handcuffs are a problem, be aware of the enticement of money. But also, there are many who they're like, we don't want to go there. We want to work at Futuro. And so, the thought that if they had graduated 15 years ago, they wouldn't have that option. Now they do. They can just be like, I'm going to set my eyes on ultimately getting a job at Futuro. It's not easy, of course. It's highly competitive, et cetera, et cetera. But I love the fact that there is a place where they can envision their career going.
So when you take into account the gravity of your career and the success, what is that one superpower that you think defines your, contribution to the industry?
That I will never give up in my commitment to being the best American journalist that I can be. And to me, that means that it's about accountability and it's about making this country be the country that it says it is. You can't be a country that says we celebrate freedom of expression and then not celebrate journalists. So I take that really seriously. Really, really seriously. In some ways, being tiny is my superpower because people are like, oh, she's so small, she can't be that big of a threat. And then it's like, kabam! I like to think also that I don't think I have a big mouth, but I will ask anyone anything at any time. And I do think that that is a little bit of a superpower. And I feel like also a superpower is being able to understand that no matter your insecurities, that you have a greater responsibility. And it doesn't come easily, but I do feel like that's a superpower that you can certainly share and teach others to have.
Well, you've definitely earned your cape, so thank you. For me, one of the most important concepts that came out of both of these conversations is the connection to heritage and history. I think that's something we typically just forget or avoid in some cases. But here are two women who've done that unapologetically and to a degree that's had such a great impact on the businesses that we make and the communities that we serve and how they see the world and how they're able to help others achieve their visions as well. Being the first of anything in any industry is already difficult, let alone if you're representing in any way, shape, or form a marginalized group. Here are two women who really literally had a shovel in their hand, digging the pathway for others to follow. There's a lot of responsibility that comes along with that, whether you ask for it or not, you're getting it. And they embrace that responsibility to a degree that we should be celebrating and honoring and aspiring to. I think the fact that both of these leaders have created spaces that are inclusive of all sorts of people is actually an example of undoing the experience that was done to them. And that's the part that's most important to me.